And welcome back to the Financially Simple Podcast. I'm your host, Justin Goodbread, and today we're going to dive into yet another personal financial question, if you will, with my colleague and friend, Mr. Jeff Jetter. How are you today, brother?
I'm doing really well, thank you.
Buddy, I'm looking at you through this video, and for those of you who don't realize, we actually videotape our podcast. We share them on YouTube, and we have, something like 55,000 downloads per YouTube video, not to mention the podcast videos, Jeff, and they're going to see this shirt that you're wearing. Dude, what's up?
Well, this is one of my Hawaiian shirts, but this is actually a fairly subtle shirt. It's a blue shirt, but I've got some much more colorful ones. We're going into a long weekend, the unofficial start of summer, so I'm ready.
I hear you, buddy. You know, a couple of weeks ago during the middle of the Groundhog Day, I mean, it's COVID-19, whatever you want to call it. It feels like in Groundhog Day in the movie here with Bill Murray. I wore my bright, wild yellow shirt, put some beach scenes in the background. Everybody was like, dude, we love the shirt, love the beach. We want to be there. So, dude, you're inspiring me, Jeff, for summertime. I'm ready for it.
I think we all are. I think everybody's ready.
We're going to talk about something, though, that not everybody's ready for, okay? So we talk about this idea of portfolios. Now, you and I stand pretty much in alignment that for business owners, we believe that their business is often their largest asset. We see so many financial statements out there, Jeff, and you know, we spend a lot of time through the Heritage Business Advisory team teaching business owners how to drastically increase the value of their largest asset. But inevitably, whenever you and your department are crunching through financial plans, we end up having to deal with this portfolio, often in terms of securities of some sort. Typically, those are investable assets outside of real estate, which I like, and business, which I like. So we're talking about securities type of portfolios here. And as a business owner, and as those of us who consult business owners, our portfolio is often treated not with the same respect maybe as our business is. And so today we want to dive into this question: how much risk should I take as a business owner? How much risk should you take as a business owner with our investment portfolio? And with that kind of introduction, Jeff, as another CFP on our team here, let's begin by describing or defining what is portfolio risk.
Well, typically when you look at any risk, it's our exposure to a hazard. In other words, how likely are we to run into something that's going to go in a negative direction, in a bad direction? When it comes to portfolio investments in our securities, we've got several different risks. We've got industry risk, market risk, interest rate risk, inflationary risk. There are all, in the CFP world, in the financial planning world, we can go way deep in the weeds and analyzing these, but I don't want to do that on this podcast. That's not the purpose of this. What I want to do is introduce sort of what we do to take a look at those risks, and then what we do to try to mitigate them.
Well, and to that point, Jeff, I've actually written various articles on the blog about all the various risks. I mean, we have symmetric and asymmetric risks. I mean, we can get real fancy, as you say, in the weeds. And so what we'll make sure we have a link in the show notes, or we'll have a link in the YouTube video about right here as I'm speaking. They'll put a link up there that you can click on if you want to see those various risks that Jeff's alluding to. Obviously, we don't want to go into detail today. That's not the purpose of today's conversation. But Jeff, let me ask you, let's simplify it then for our listening audience, because not everybody gets to see our beautiful faces on YouTube today. Some of them are riding in the car saying, thank God, I'd probably wreck if I saw your face, Justin. But, you know, here nor there. How do we then measure risk? You know, do we look at it? You know, often I hear people say from a scale of 1 to 10 or 1 to 100. What's the layman's term of how we can measure risk? Is there a gradual scale? Is there ABC? How do we go about that?
Well, and it really does come down to sort of an arbitrary scale, sliding scale, if you will. So, and everybody's different when it comes to their risk, both the risk tolerance and the risk capacity. Two things I do want to talk about a little bit in today's podcast. But there is no set grading system. For us here at Heritage, we use a sort of a 1 to 100 scale, but you can certainly do that on a 1 to 10 scale. You can do it highest to lowest, 1 to 5. I've worked in a lot of different environments. We like to do 1 to 100 because it can really laser focus the client on exactly what it is we're talking about.
So ultimately, we're trying to discover what their risk tolerance, and that's a very technical term. We're trying to discover what their risk tolerance is. So whenever you go as a planning client enters into the financial planning world that you're dealing with, you're ultimately trying to determine that number. And as you mentioned, the company uses a scale of 1 to 100. And
Mhm.
so anywhere within that sliding scale, they may fall in at a 67 or a 34 or a 99 or a 1 even. So depending on where their risk is, you're trying to figure out that tolerance. So let's talk about what that tolerance is. When I hear the word tolerance, first thing I think of Emily with our kids. She says, I'm not going to tolerate that anymore. Right. And I can
Right.
remember my dad saying, son, I'm not going to tolerate that. Right. So that's when I hear the word tolerance. I also reminded my mind's eye to my dad, who was in the construction field. And he would talk about the tolerance effect of a particular piece of lumber or a particular piece of steel that had a heavier weight tolerance in place. It can hold more weight. How do we relate tolerance, using that term, into the financial world that you and I live in?
Yeah, and it's funny you bring both of those up, because if you think about both those analogies, we're talking about limits. Where is Emily's limit? Right? That's her tolerance. Yeah.
Depends on
Where
the
is the
day.
limit? Yeah. Yeah. So where is the structural limit when you brought up your structural example? So where are the limits of that tolerance? So what we try to do is we try to work with the client, help coach them a little bit. But really what I want to try to figure out whenever we're working with a financial planning client is I want to figure out what your limits are. Where is your tolerance? So I don't want to introduce a risky portfolio that is well outside of your risk limits or your risk tolerance. Does that make sense?
It does. Let me see if I can put it this way. I lived through 07, 08, and 09 as a financial advisor. I joined in the industry, I think it was 2003 or 4. I can't remember off the top of my head, when I first became licensed. And I had a good 4 or 5 years before that debacle, that collapse, that calamity hit us, right? And 2008, 09, and 9 was just unmeasurable. I mean, I think it forever has burned my generation and older, knowing what the
Mhm.
markets could do. And Jeff, I remember during that time period, people would say, well, I'm an aggressive investor. I have a tolerance at a 90, right? And then all of a sudden that collapse happened. And then, man, the lawsuits which were flung at the financial industry, and candidly, many of them were justified, and at the frustration, the pain, the suffering that people had. And ultimately, the hardest thing that hurt me is that whenever you had a risk assessment or a tolerance that you thought was accurate, and now because of that pressure, that weight, that burden that was pushed on top of the industry, people ended up making some very poor decisions. They ended up selling at a loss. I never forget a particular individual who sold at a loss, panicked, sold at a loss, and then bought in months later. Here we came into now the 2018 cycle, at Q4 of 2018, when the market fell. If you're looking at any particular index, they fell significantly, some as high as 18% in less than 6 trading days. And that individual sold at a loss again. And we had already pushed his tolerance to the lowest possible position, almost to the point of cash. And he would say one thing when the sunshine was out, but then when the rain would come, it'd be something else. So is identifying risk tolerance, trying to find the constant thread between the sunshine, the rain, between the good times and the bad. And if so, to what end? Is it to prevent somebody from hurting themselves on the high side or the low side? What's the whole point of trying to figure this out?
Well, ultimately, that's where we come in as advisors, is to try to coach them through some of that. What we don't want to do is reset our tolerance every time an emotional event happens, whether that be a very strong, positive emotional event. We just, we bought a little bit of Netflix, and Netflix all of a sudden tripled. So now we think, oh, I can go off and I can be a great stock investor now. When really we just got a home run. We got a home run, and that's great. Let's count our blessings, but let's get back into our risk tolerance mode. And likewise, on a negative impact, we don't want fear to drive us because something bad had happened. Of course, we've had a recent market reduction. I think we're all familiar with that. And certainly a lot of volatility in the market over the last 8-10 weeks. So we don't want that to completely reset our tolerance. Now, it may impact where we set our portfolio, but we don't want to make too many drastic decisions at a time of emotional stress, positive or negative. I don't
So
know
I
if I
got to go.
answered your question though.
You did, I think so. Let me go back
Okay.
and clear one thing up. You mentioned Netflix in particular. Friends, that's not an advice. That's not a recommendation to buy Netflix. Let me just go ahead back and say that, okay? It's not a recommendation to buy a particular stock. We're going to recommend you do your own due diligence whenever it comes to individual stocks. In fact, very seldom does our firm recommend individual equities whatsoever. And that's not what Jeff meant, but because that one term was said, I had to clarify that because we have some regulators that try to keep our industry honest. And so I'm going to say that is not an advice. And in fact, nothing we're talking about is advice. This is just educational purposes only, and you should do your own due diligence. And just because whatever happened in the past may not happen in the future, and past performance is not indicative of future results. So those are the disclaimers we have to say whenever we start mentioning some of these things. So Jeff, as we kind of go back though in an idea of nailing down this tolerance, it would seem to me it's almost like the constant position. We're trying to make sure we've set the GPS, so to speak, in our car as we were going to take that journey across the country, so to speak. Or whenever I was offshore with my family and we were fishing or whatever, we would set the coordinates. And when you get out in the ocean, everything looks the same. When you're in the swamp in South Georgia doing some deer hunting or gator hunting or whatever, it all looks the same. So you'd have to have a GPS that would hold you true no matter what transpired. As I think I heard you say, maybe I want to be clear on this, a risk tolerance is no more than trying to figure out your emotional stability. It's trying to match how much pressure you can take within your particular person, whether the time is good or bad. Is that a way to describe it maybe?
Yeah, it goes back to your limits. And I almost want to take your GPS example a little further. It's not necessarily setting the course, it's setting the speed on which we're going to get to the destination. So think of speed limit, right? Your speed limit on that particular journey. As you know, I'm a pilot, so sometimes I talk in airspeed and sometimes I talk in ground speed, and not always are they the same. As a matter of fact, very infrequently. It takes wind conditions and all kinds of things like that. But what I want to sort of bring this back to something that everybody can understand is not only are we setting the GPS coordinates of where we want to go, but we want to set the speed on which we're comfortable getting there. Okay, my in-laws travel up from Atlanta quite a bit. They would much rather be on 411 the whole way, going about 40, 45 miles an hour. Takes them a little longer, but they're much more comfortable at that pace and that drive. Me, when I go visit them, I'm out there on the interstate getting after it, just at the speed limit, of course.
So, but let me ask you this, though, Jeff. Some people may not have the luxury because of life. They were moving right along, and all of a sudden they have some life event, and now they can't afford to drive down 411. If they do, they may not hit their destination within the appointed time that they've desired. Do we run an issue when it comes to creating a risk tolerance, especially during financial planning, to where someone says, I want to reach, let's say, the in-laws house by this date at this time. In order for me to do that, I have to drive at 75 mile an hour. Or you know what, I got a late start, and now you know what, I've got to drive at 90 mile an hour to get there. I mean, there's got to be a certain point to where the emotions control at some point. And I hate to say that in that format, but there's got to be a point where the tolerance level of the emotions play. But then there's also got to be a point to where the desire and the need, or whatever the precipice is for that particular path or that particular trip is, there has to be the point where you marry up the emotions and the desire, the need that it has to accomplish the goal. Is that part of risk tolerance, or is that something totally different?
Well, that's part of our risk assessment, and what that's called is risk capacity. So risk capacity is a little different than tolerance. Tolerance is how we feel about it, what I'd like to do. It is more comfortable for me to be on the back roads going 45 miles an hour. That's my nature. That's where I'd like to be. In our example, that's my in-laws' comfort level. My comfort level is again getting out there and going as quick as I can. But their comfort level is a little slower. Now, what we have to do then is take a look at, are we going to meet our destination at the intended target time? And that's where risk capacity comes into play. And so we may have to say, you know what, going 40, 45 miles an hour and stopping for lunch along the way is not going to get you to your destination by dinner time tonight. We may have to look at some alternate paths. We may have to look at maybe skipping the lunch break I'm trying to make the analogy work, but really we may have to say, we may have to bump that risk up a little. And then what we can do is intelligently talk to our clients about that. Here's the risk tolerance that you're comfortable with. Here's the risk capacity we think you may need to reach your goals. Now that doesn't mean we're gonna trash their feelings, nor does it mean we're gonna go at this aggressive. What we're gonna do then is have that conversation. Is lunch more important than getting there by dinner tonight? Or is getting there by dinner tonight more important than stopping for lunch? And so we can have that intelligent conversation with the client now and actually show them, if we hold this 30 mile an hour, 40 mile an hour risk tolerance into our portfolio, we might not reach our goals when we want to. Which one then is more important? And we may have to encourage a little added risk. Of course, what we don't want to do is put them in a position where they're uncomfortable, and then ultimately we'll start making those emotional changes at the worst possible time that you mentioned.
Right, because then you're driving too fast on the interstate and aren't capable of handling the fast slowdown, and you go into a wreck ultimately, and they end up hurting somebody. So, Jeff, as the listeners of what we're tracking on demographic here on the podcast, we have two major sects of listeners, or two different slots of listeners. We have the business owners. That are typically in that age of 40 to 60 range. And then we have some non-business owners who are thinking about starting a business. We're getting a lot more individuals like that. And the way I look at it in my head is that most times, as I often see it, man, this is not a carte blanche blanket statement across the whole, populace of people out in the world by no means, but as I often see it, many times business owners have spent so much time investing in their business. And as we've analyzed in depth on the show, if 80% of my net worth is my business and I only have a 4% success rate of actually selling it for a profit, at least what I think it's worth, then I have to build some assets outside of my business. Those who are trying to start a business, oftentimes are realizing they're not going to match their destination. So now they're trying to take a different position, maybe looking at a business to start to help them free up some cash flow to help them accelerate their journey, so to speak. Whenever I see this though, Jeff, I realize that it's not uncommon for people to hit their, let's say, mid 30s, early 40s. And at that point, just to begin, actually, saying, yeah, I had this old little Roth IRA over here, and I've got my emergency fund, and I've kind of paid off all my student loans and my debt. Now I've got some extra cash. I need to pour this at some point. Is there a danger? And I'm asking a very generic question to let you take it whichever way you want to go. But is there a danger whenever you're dealing with an individual, a business owner, or a non-business owner who's maybe mid 40s, they don't really have it saved up? What I would say the millionaire next door's formula is, where we have, someone that's 40 years old may have $500,000 right away. Very few people do that. Now we've got to take some cash flow and start socking it away to reach our age 60 or 70 goal. Is there a danger with being more aggressive in the earlier days, even though my tolerance and my capacity may be way down here? Is there a danger being more aggressive than being less aggressive when I'm young?
Well, I'm not sure I understand the question. I think you're asking about an increased risk in your portfolio management rather than an increased risk necessarily in your conviction towards your new business. Is that? Let's
say it this way. Is there a danger? Is there a danger with the increased risk in the portfolio at a young age, even though my risk tolerance level may say I shouldn't invest that great?
Typically, no. With an additional time horizon, that always mitigates our risk to some extent, especially when we're talking about market risks. So when I've got plenty of time, as long as I don't have an immediate need for those resources. So going back to that young business owner who's putting some money into their business, if they need access to that capital, and we set them in a high risk portfolio, whether by their design or ours, and we need access to that capital, we may be in a pickle when we need it, that it's going to be in a depressed position. So we might want to go with they're more conservative in that option. Now, if we've got our operating capital set aside and we're looking at true retirement assets, no, we might want to get a little more aggressive with those retirement assets.
You know, you bring up a lot of interesting points here. You just said you brought in cash into play, you brought in time into play, you brought in age into play, you brought in capital, business into play. So I'm struggling here. If I could pull my hair right now, I would. But in fact, I need another haircut, friends. I hate long hair, and it just itches when it gets this way. But if I could figure out all those various capitals, I think I could come to the conclusion. But so that leads me to the question, Jeff: how do I marry? Use that terminology. Marry risk tolerance with risk capacity. How do I bring those two together to where I can use it to accomplish my particular goals?
Well, I think one of the best ways to do that is through a advisory process. Get your success team involved, whether it be us or one of your other team members, and we start looking at where can we eliminate the risk, where do we want to take additional risk. Now, one of the great things about working with Heritage is we've got Heritage Business Advisors, and David and Justin with their team of Heritage Business Advisors is going to help that business owner know how to place assets so that there is that safety net. And then what do we need to deploy into the market environment and maybe accept a little higher risk for future assets.
You know, Jeff, I got one more question. I have one more question. I just said I got it. I got to tell you, friends, that word "got" hurts my ears. I don't know why. In fact, everybody's laughing at me in the office because I'm trying to remove "got" from my vernacular. In fact, when Raquel in my office, she picks on me every time I use the word "got." So I don't know why. Someone send me a tweet and say, "Justin, you lost your mind." You know, send it on Facebook and say, "Justin, you're a moron. Don't worry about it." You know, whatever you want to pick on me a little bit about the word "got." Okay, I don't know why. In fact, I could see a shirt in my future or a hat in my future coming that has the word "got" on it. I just see it coming already from one of you clowns out there in the listener world. Just having fun with you a little bit. But Jeff, one of the things in all candidness, whenever we see comprehensive planning and we're bringing into cash flow and taxes and all these various things into place, and as we now start talking about risk tolerance, there's this idea in the industry that you often could take a quick surmise of your age, and that age should dictate what your risk tolerance should be. And I wanted to get your take on it. So here's what I often hear is they'll say, okay, you take the number 100, because let's say assume you're going to live to 100, and you subtract your current age, and let's say I'm 40. I'm saying I'm 40 because for simple math. Let's say I'm 40. So that means I should have 60%, the difference of that subtraction, 60% equities and 40% fixed income. Is that necessarily the case when it's talking about risk tolerance or risk capacity?
No, is the easy answer to that. The harder answer is, however, there are rules of thumb. Okay, so especially when we're talking about the non-business owner financial planning client, your W-2 family, and we work with a lot of families that don't have businesses. Some of those quote unquote rules of thumb are not too far off sometimes. I remember learning about a 50-50-50 rule. When you turn 50, you should have about an equal or balanced portfolio. And to some extent, that can hold true when your portfolio is, for the most part, your only asset. But when you're talking about your business owners, and we've got our business holding, we've got real estate holdings, we've got qualified assets, we've got non-qualified assets, you can't just stick to a rule of thumb. And I think this is my third or fourth podcast with you, Justin, and almost always you give me that one zinger question, and I can't think of a single time where I've answered it yet. So it depends on your circumstance, and it always does depend on your circumstance. So it is an individual and unique circumstance for you, our client, and even our listener. So it's really hard to listen to, we've got pundits and radio broadcasters and entertainers and things that make these blanket statements about a lot of financial tools, resources, and you just can't make those kind of blanket statements. Everybody's different. Every circumstance is different. What we need to do is sit down. What is your risk tolerance? What is your risk capacity? In other words, how do you feel? What do you need? And how do we make sure that we get you on the right path and at the right speed to get you to your goals?
I can't think of a better way to end the podcast than what Jeff just said, friends. So here's my ending to this. Risk tolerance is one of those things which oftentimes, as he mentioned, the pundits love to talk about. Whenever you have a fiduciary, an individual who candidly you can sue, that has to defend themselves before a jury of their peers. Okay. Whenever you're talking with someone who's butts on the line for the advice they give, it becomes interesting that some of those rules and some of those hard and fast radio personalities can't defend, especially against someone like me who knows what they're talking about. Another CFP like Jeff who knows what they're talking about. It's oftentimes hard to defend it. So my challenge to you is, as a business owner, I realize that my business is my greatest asset. I realize that. But as I get older, I have to now start diversifying away from my business, and I have to use other things. We've mentioned several of those on the show. As you're looking at these ideas of risk tolerance and you're approaching your particular planner, if you don't have a planner, reach out to us. Jeff and the team and his team will be happy to walk you through the planning process. You never know, you might work into the business side of things with me and David and our team on that side. But as you go into this world of planning, I want to challenge you with this idea that risk tolerance matters. It matters a lot. The last thing that any planner, no matter what stripe or color they may be, no matter what, one thing I can tell you, every planner is they don't want to see you hurt yourself. They don't want that to happen. I know the planners of our country. I know a lot of them. They really genuinely value that you will do what's right for you and help you reach your goals. And so risk tolerance is one of those pivotal points. So look, Jeff's going to be back on the show here with us in a couple more weeks. We're going to dive into another personal financial planning question. Hey, look, if you have a question for Jeff that you'd like to cover with us on the financial planning highlight that we're dealing with now, so go to financialsimple.com and leave us a remark there. You can go to Ask Justin, and it'll come to Jeff and his team, and they'll begin working on this. In fact, this very question actually came through a listener who made a mention, and it came through the system internally on, hey, how do you deal with risk tolerance? So I think we did an okay job at answering that today. The writers are going to make it sound really good when they go on the blog on financiallysimple.com. The editors will make our faces look beautiful on YouTube. Until next time, look, I want you to remember from Jeff and I, life is hard. It is. But man, life is good. We're going into Memorial Day, man. Jeff's wearing a Hawaiian shirt today, bro. I love it. Thank you for doing that. Made my day. Life is good. And life can be frustrating. It can be. None of us expected to be where we're at today, January 1st of this year. It can be frustrating. Money doesn't have to be. Hey, look, we're here to make your life at least financially simple. Until next time, y'all go out and make it a great day.